digital clock on the dashboard read 5:04 a.m. 4 young people sat in a parked Volkswagen Polo in stand ground Peterborough. The tension thick in the air after nearly 2 hours of erratic driving. What had started as a night of celebration was turning into something far, far darker. In the front passenger seat, 18-year-old Martyna Ogonowska's hand clutched something beneath her clothing. Words were exchanged. A hand placed unwelcomely on a leg pushed away in anger. Then came a sound, what witnesses would later describe as someone being punched. But this was no punch, as blood began to spread across Filip Jaskiewicz's chest. Martyna fled the vehicle, screaming to her friends, "Let's go! Let's go!" By sunrise, one life had ended, and another would be forever changed by 17 years behind bars. Hello people, Sgt Grumpy here. Welcome back to the channel where we investigate the strange, the unexplained, and sometimes the tragically all too human. Today we're diving into one of the most contentious murder cases to hit the UK headlines in recent years. One that's generated fierce debate about self-defence, trauma response, and justice. The Martyna Ogonowska case has become a rallying point for women's rights advocates who see her as a victim twice over. First, of intimate assault, and then of a justice system that's failed to understand trauma-induced reactions. But as always on this channel, we don't jump to conclusions. We examine the evidence, we consider all the angles, and we try to arrive at a fact-based understanding of what actually really happened. So settle in, folks. This is going to be a long one as we unpack a case that raises difficult questions about carrying weapons, reasonable force, and how past trauma influences split-second decisions. Before we dive into the events of October the 21st, 2018, let's understand who Martyna Ogonowska was. And if I'm butchering names here, you'll have to excuse me. As you can tell, I have something of an accent, being Scottish. Get over it if it offends you. Born in Poland, Martyna moved to the UK at age 12 with her mother and younger brother, reportedly to escape domestic violence from her father. They settled in Peterborough, where she enrolled in secondary school. Life in Peterborough wasn't easy for young Martyna. She struggled with the English language, much like I do. She was bullied by peers and performed poorly academically. Recent evidence obtained during appeal proceedings suggests she may have had an intellectual or learning disability. At aged 14, Martyna's life took a significant turn where she allegedly experienced an intimate assault. According to Justice for Women, she was forcibly subject to relations and intimately assaulted by an adult male who groomed her on Facebook. I excuse the use of flowery language here, but as you know, the YouTube algorithm doesn't like certain words. It's hard to be an adult sometimes. She reported the incident to police through a friend who could speak better English. The suspect was arrested and initially denied penetration, but 3 months later he changed his account and admitted to the activity while claiming he didn't know her age. But despite this admission, the police ultimately took no further action against the man in January 2016. Following this incident, Martyna largely stopped attending school and would sometimes go missing overnight. We would call this perhaps going off the rails. Records indicate she was known to police through Operation MakeSafe, which focused on sexual exploitation. At 16, Martyna became pregnant and gave birth to her daughter, reportedly suffering from significant postnatal depression afterwards. By October 2018, Martyna was 18 years old, a young mother with a troubled past, but her life was about to intersect with that of Filip Jaskiewicz in the most tragic way. Martyna and Filip Jaskiewicz had only known each other for a few days before the incident, having been introduced by a mutual friend. By all accounts, Filip was besotted with the girl and hoped their relationship would develop. On Saturday, October the 20th, 2018, Filip arrived at Martyna's home bearing flowers. That night, they would join Martyna's mother and her friends Peter Sisko and Sophie Fedakova for a birthday celebration that would lead them to the Solstice nightclub in Peterborough. Let's reconstruct the events of that night. On the evening of October the 20th, 2018, Filip arrived at Martyna's home with flowers. The group then drank alcohol at Martyna's home, celebrating Peter Sisko's birthday. They then headed out to the Solstice nightclub in Peterborough. Martyna's mother, ever the thoughtful one, brings a blue plastic bag containing alcohol. They hide this in a bush near the club. In the early hours of October the 21st, CCTV shows normal club activity inside, and Martyna is seen on that, sitting on Filip's lap. Around 1:42 a.m, Martyna steps outside and talks to her ex-boyfriend named Ahmed. While outside, she's denied re-entry to the club. She then goes to the bush and retrieves the blue plastic bag her mother had hidden earlier. Peter and Sophie are also outside the club, and she meets up with them. Around 2 a.m, Filip contacts Martyna. The group of four then get together and walk to Filip's Volkswagen Polo that's parked in the Central Park area. Filip, who we later find out was well over the drink-drive limit, begins driving erratically at high speed with the group in the car. The passengers became frightened and repeatedly ask him to stop. He continues driving, nowhere in particular, and rather fast, for nearly 2 hours. Martyna is reportedly in tears during this drive, as is Sophie. At 5:04 a.m, Filip finally stops the car in the stand ground area. Martyna gets out of the car and tries to walk away. Filip follows her, and they argue. The confrontation escalates, and Filip pushes or grabs her, causing her to fall to the ground. At this point, Justice for Women's account stated he grabbed her by the throat, shook her, and threw her to the ground, and attempted to intimately assault her until her two friends intervened. It's not quite what the witnesses say, however, we shall return to the events. After the situation had calmed down, they all return to the vehicle, and Martyna initially sits in the back seat, but then, for some unknown reason, moves to the front passenger seat next to Filip. In the car, arguing resumes. Filip, again, with the unwanted attention, puts his hand on Martyna's leg. She pushes it away. There is some discrepancy in the testimony that was given at the time, but there may have been other unwanted intimate contact. However, at that point, Peter and Sophie in the back seat hear a noise like someone being punched. This is actually Martyna stabbing Filip once in the chest with a kitchen knife. Martyna pulls the knife out and flees the car. She is heard screaming, "Let's go, let's go." She then shows her bloody hands and the knife to her friends. They all move away from the vehicle, and later near an Aldi, they call a taxi. Martyna also calls her ex-boyfriend Ahmed. The taxi takes Martyna, Peter and Sophie to Ahmed's home. At Ahmed's, the knife is cleaned and Martyna changes clothes. No one has called for an ambulance for Filip. Martyna then messages her mother on Facebook. "I fit him with a knife. The whole knife went into his heart, Mum. What should I do?" At 7 a.m, passers-by discover Filip's body. An ambulance is called, but Filip is declared dead at the scene. At 7:17 a.m, Martyna arrives at Thorpe Wood police station with a knife. and turns herself in. She initially claims she punched Philip, but later admits to the stabbing, calling it an accident. On April the 25th, 2019, following a trial at Cambridge Crown Court, Martyna was convicted of murder and possession of a bladed article. The jury rejected her defences of self-defence and diminished responsibility by a vote of 11-1. Judge David Farrell, QC, sentenced her to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 17 years, less 121 days for time spent on remand. She also received a concurrent 18-month sentence for the knife possession charge. During the trial, psychiatric evidence became central to the case. The defence psychiatrist testified that Martyna suffered from severe PTSD caused by the alleged forced relation in 2015, which would have impacted her reaction to the attempted assault by Philip, or actual assault. However, the prosecution psychiatrist disputed this, suggesting she had only mild PTSD and questioning whether she had been forcibly related at all. Martyna applied for permission to appeal both her conviction and sentence. While she was granted leave to appeal her sentence, she was initially refused permission to appeal her conviction. She then renewed her application for permission to appeal the conviction before the full court on November the 9th, 2022. As recently as May 2025, Martyna lost her appeal against her jail term. The Court of Appeal refused her renewed application for leave to appeal against her conviction. Okay, that's the events of the night and the subsequent legal proceedings. Let's take a step back and try and approach this from an analytical point. We'll analyse it like proper investigators. As you know, I've spent 20 years on the front line of the police service and another 10 in the back, if you pardon the expression. And one thing I've learned is that emotions run high in these cases, but facts are what matter. So let's look at Martyna's actions critically. First, there's the matter of the knife itself. Prosecution argued, and the judge eventually concluded, that Martyna brought the knife with her that night, either in the blue plastic bag or concealed in her clothing. This is significant because it suggests an element of premeditation, not necessarily to kill, but certainly at minimum to arm oneself. And while carrying a weapon for self-defence might seem reasonable, especially for a young woman with prior trauma, the UK law is unfortunately very clear. Carrying knives in public without good reason is illegal. Obviously, I'm not counting the exceptions, which are penknives with a blade of less than 3 inches. The judge emphasised this point during sentencing, noting the carrying of knives and the use of knives is something which causes the public significant concern, and those who carry and use knives should expect to receive significant sentences. Had you not been carrying a knife, you would not be where you are now, and Philip would still be alive. And while that's a factual statement, it may sound quite harsh. Now, it's important to acknowledge that Judge Farrell did accept that Philip had undoubtedly touched her intimately and was violent to her shortly before he was killed. This suggests the court did believe some form of assault occurred. However, the judge determined that this didn't meet the threshold for a self-defence claim, stating there's no reasonable self-defence here when you used a knife which you'd brought to the scene and you clearly had the opportunity to leave. When he says opportunity to leave, she did in fact leave the car, remember? She could have continued walking away. And that's quite critical at this point. Alternatively, there were 2 of her friends in the back seat, one another male. It's not unreasonable for her to seek assistance from them rather than take the action that she ultimately did. And this indicates 2 factors that completely undermined her self-defence claim. Proportionality of response, i.e. using a knife against unwanted touching, while other alternatives were there, i.e. leaving or seeking help. Now, I know in the cold, harsh light of day, we're not 18-year-old girls that are probably inebriated, have had a past sexual history, and are traumatized. But you have to take into the account that how did she get that weapon? She had to have brought it with her in one form or another. Or she had to have accepted it from someone else at some point or another. And then we have our actions after the stabbing. And these are quite damning in my view. Rather than calling an ambulance or police, she fled the scene. She then went to Ahmed's house and cleaned the knife and then changed her clothes. These aren't actions that someone acting in self-defense would do. These are actions where someone has a consciousness of guilt rather than the behaviour of someone who acted in legitimate self-defense. Her initial statements to the police also undermined her credibility. She first claimed she had punched the guy before later admitting to the stabbing but calling it an accident. This is the forgotten knife defence. I forgot I was holding it. It's not a particularly good one. This change in story also raises questions about her truthfulness throughout the whole thing. Looking again at the accidental stabbing claim, Martyna's primary defence, that she forgot she was holding the knife when she punched Filip, was rejected by the jury. And this claim does seem implausible given that she had to have been holding the knife in her hand deliberately before the stabbing occurred. Judge Farrell ultimately concluded that Martyna became annoyed. You wanted attention and showed him the knife, and in anger deliberately stabbed him, intending to cause him, at the very least, really serious bodily harm. Now, I'm not quite sure where the judge is getting this from, because I don't see it in witness testimony. And if nobody's spoken to it, and the accused hasn't said it, then surely the judge here is overstepping his remit by making things up. And I've noticed this, that some judges seem to think that they can read people's minds. And that's not what you're there to do, sir. You're there to examine the evidence and come to a reasoned and legal conclusion. I may be wrong. Any judges or barristers out there that wish to inform me, feel free. I am but a lowly ex-police sergeant. But since Martyna's conviction, her case has become a focal point for women's rights advocates and organisations like Justice for Women. And they describe her as a double victim of a misogynist justice system. Their campaign frames her case as an example of how the justice system fails to understand trauma responses and properly account for self-defence in the context of intimate assault. And social media has jumped on this bandwagon. They've amplified these concerns, with many users expressing outrage at what they perceive as an excessive sentence for a young woman defending herself against intimate assault. Comments on platforms like Reddit and X show divided opinions, with many suggesting the punishment does not fit the crime. Some commenters even point out that people that have done more to children get lesser sentences. And that is indeed true. The advocacy, though, focuses heavily on Martyna's prior trauma and how it might have influenced her reaction that night. And Justice for Women argues that the prosecution unfairly undermined her account of being forcibly related at 14, employing classic victim-blaming tropes and common forcible relationship myths. Well, after reviewing all the evidence, what conclusions can we draw about this complex and controversial case? And first of all, what we have to do is we have to acknowledge the tragedy here. Filip Jaskiewicz lost his life at 23. Martyna Ogonowska, a young mother of 18 with a troubled past, is serving a lengthy prison sentence. There are no winners in this scenario. The evidence certainly suggests that Filip did at the very least behave inappropriately towards Martyna. Judge Farrell himself acknowledged that Philip touched her intimately and was violent shortly before his death. This is not in dispute, and it's no doubt in my mind he should have faced consequences. But should those consequences have included losing his life? However, several key factors have undermined the self-defense claim. The presence of the knife. Martyna brought a weapon to the scene. That indicates some level of premeditation. And then we have to look at proportionality. UK law requires that force used in self-defense be reasonable and proportionate. Single stab to the chest in response to unwanted touching, while certainly traumatic, especially to someone with PTSD, probably exceeds what most would consider proportionate, especially when you consider there are alternatives available. And as the judge noted, Martyna had other options. She could have left, as she actually did, and then came back to the car. She could have kept walking away, or she could have sought help from her friends who were in the back seat. This is a Volkswagen Polo. It's not a big car. They weren't far away. She wasn't being prevented from speaking. She could even have opened the door and screamed. They were in a residential street. Someone would probably have called the police at the very least. And then, more damning than anything in my view, is what she did after the incident. She pulled the knife out. She fled the car, screaming, "Let's go, let's go." Her friends pursued her. She showed them her bloodied hands. They called a taxi. So she fled the scene. She cleaned the weapon. She changed her clothes. And no one thought to call an ambulance for Philip. We don't know his status. They don't know his status. Nobody called for help. And this suggests consciousness of guilt. This is not the actions of someone who acted in legitimate self-defense. And then when she went to the police, after asking for advice from her mother, she initially made a false statement, then changed it. That completely undermines her credibility. Was a 17-year sentence excessive? And this is perhaps the most debatable aspect of the case, because the minimum term for murder with a knife in the UK is 25 years. But Judge Farrell reduced this significantly, citing Martyna's young age, previous good character, and intellectual limitations, and the provocation that she did experience. Despite this reduction, many still view 17 years as excessive for an 18-year-old first-time offender who had been assaulted. What about the PTSD defence? While this defence psychiatrist diagnosed severe PTSD, the prosecution's expert disagreed. This is normal. Normally, obviously, the defence and the prosecution are going to pick witnesses that agree with the crux of their argument. And the jury, though, ultimately sided with the prosecution's view. Whether the prosecution expert's testimony was fair and accurate has been questioned in the appeals process, but the appeals court has maintained the conviction. So as investigators, we need to be careful not to let our sympathies cloud our judgment. Yes, Martyna had a troubled past and experienced trauma. Yes, Philip behaved inappropriately. And yes, he should have had consequences. But as I said, should those consequences have been taking his life? All the evidence here points to a deliberate act of violence that exceeded reasonable self-defense, followed by attempts to evade responsibility. And while the justice system isn't perfect and reasonable people can disagree about the appropriate sentence, but based on the available evidence, the jury's decision to convict Martyna of murder, rather than a lesser charge like manslaughter, appears to be legally sound, if emotionally difficult to accept. In the end, this case reminds us of the terrible consequences that can follow when weapons enter volatile situations. As Judge Farrell observed, had you not been carrying a knife, you would not be where you are now. and Philip would still be alive. And yeah, you could say, but what would have happened to her? But again, we have to remember the alternative. She had two friends there in the car. One was a male. She could have left the car, which she had previously done. She could have walked away. She could have screamed. She could have shouted and screamed in the street. At 5 o'clock in the morning, people are going to get up and they're going to phone the police. There were plenty of alternatives available to her, but she went equipped. She went equipped to defend herself, and she has paid the consequence here. What do you think? If you were a member of the jury, what would you have done? Would you have convicted? 11 of the jury members convicted, and one said no. I think that's quite conclusive. Well, I think that concludes our deep dive into the Martyna Ogonowska case. And as always, I've tried to present the facts fairly and examine all angles without jumping to conclusions. If there's one lesson here, it's that split-second decisions can change lives forever. For vulnerable young people, especially, carrying weapons might seem like protection, but they often escalate situations beyond repair. Was justice served in this case? Or was Martyna failed by the system? Let me know your thoughts. If I'm wrong, but let's keep it civil, because this is about seeking truth, not inflaming emotions. And if you found this analysis valuable, please consider supporting the channel. Like, share, subscribe, even drop me a donation on Ko-fi.com. Stay skeptical, stay curious, and stay safe out there.